Hi, this is Tori Sincere, the Adventist Watchman. In today's video, we're going to answer a question that was given by a subscriber that saw my video on Ellen White and the Amalgamation. The user's name is Chesed Walnut 3062. I'm probably butchering that, so please forgive me. But here's what this person says. They say, well, what about Uriah Smith's statement in terms of racists? I believe the subscriber is referring to Uriah Smith's article or letter or book where he talked about the amalgamation of man and beast, referring to what Ellen White was talking about. Okay. And so in today's video, we're going to examine this statement or these statements that were made by Uriah Smith. And we're going to ask the question, are these statements racist? Because that's what his critics are saying, that Uriah Smith was calling blacks subhuman. But was he really? Well, in today's video, you're going to find out without a shadow of a doubt, Uriah Smith wasn't being a racist. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome to the second video on our series on amalgamation, and you should understand that this controversy on the amalgamation didn't end with Ellen White. All right. Now, from what we know, Ellen White never publicly clarified her statement or what she meant on the amalgamation of man and beast. Okay. And as a result of this, Uriah Smith wrote a book, and in that book, he attempted to clarify or give his interpretation of what he believed the amalgamation of man and beast that Ellen White wrote about. The book is entitled the book is titled Visions of Mrs. E.G. White, a manifestation of spiritual gifts according to the scripture. Now, Uriah Smith attempted to defend or clarify Ellen White, but he inadvertently placed himself in a little bit of controversy as well. Now, on pages 102 to 104 in this book, Uriah Smith has two statements that have caused many to believe that Uriah Smith was calling blacks subhuman, okay? And I want to read these two statements to you, and we're going to examine these statements and many more in Uriah Smith's letter, okay? But now just look at these statements closely. He says, but does anyone deny the general statement contained in the extract given above? They do not. If they did, they could easily be silenced by a reference to such cases as the wild Bushmen of Africa, some tribes of Hottentots, and perhaps the Digger Indians of our own country. The second statement, he says, is whatever race of men we may take, Bushmen, Hottentots, Patagonians, or any class of people, however low they may apparently be in the scale of humanity, their mental capabilities are in every instance the basis on which we are to work and by which we determine whether they are subjects of moral government or not. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. These statements, without context, sound horrible. It sounds like Uriah Smith is accusing blacks and Indians of being subhuman. Not only is he accusing us of not being human, but he seems to intimate that this fact is undeniable. And who would deny that? And what makes matters even worse is that according to some sources, Ellen and James White took copies of this book with this quote unquote racist statement in it. They took 2,000 copies to camp meeting with them. This source says James and Ellen White took 2,000 copies of Smith's book with them to camp meetings that year. Spectrum, June 12, 1982, page 14. Reading the accusations of Ellen White, one would ask the question, why would anyone support Uriah Smith? I mean, me as an African American, above all else, why would I support Uriah Smith? I mean, clearly, if we take these statements upon what they appear to be saying, it appears that Uriah Smith is directly insulting my ancestors and indirectly insulting me. You must understand that it's human nature to, when we see, read, or hear something, to apply our own preconceived notions to it, okay? To see them through our own experiences, all right? But we have to be careful because our own perceptions can lead us to a misinterpretation of what we are seeing, hearing, or reading, okay? And whether we are reading books, whether we are reading even the Bible, we have to always apply time and place, okay? This is part of hermeneutics. And hermeneutics basically ensures that we have the right context of what we're reading, okay? So we have to take into account time. We have to take into account place. Remember, we talked about time and place, right? We have to apply what was happening at that time. What was the reader thinking about? What language, what are the norms of the language that the user is stating that our language we may not understand. There's so many things that we have to take into a place, but essentially we have to put ourselves in this individual's shoes to understand what, as best as we can, obviously, to understand what the individual that we are reading, seeing, or hearing, what are they referring to? That being said, after reading Uriah Smith's letter and after applying proper context to it, I realize now that those who are accusing Uriah Smith are guilty of one or two things. Number one, they simply have not read Uriah Smith's article in full. Now, I know that sounds trivial, but I'm telling you, many of those who are accusing Uriah Smith, I can guarantee you, after knowing what I know now, I'm telling you, they're just not reading the letter. Number two, the second thing, they may have read the letter, but they're unfortunately applying our current Western societal norms to this 19th century article written by Uriah Smith. You'll understand what I'm saying in just a moment. Our society today, our Western society today, especially in the United States of America, is very sensitive to racial issues, okay? Now, these racial issues, we are hypersensitive to them, especially if they come from a white man, okay? And I want to be clear about this. I'm not suggesting that racism doesn't exist, okay? I'm just saying that, let me give you an example. If a white man said, or a white person, whether it's a man or woman, if a white person says, there are more crimes committed by the black demographic than any other race, okay? I'm just throwing that out there. Whether that's true or not, please, no responses on that, because that's not the intent of this video. I'm trying to make a point here is that let's suppose that was true. Let's say that that in this nation of the United States, more black people per group, okay, per ratio, more black people create or are responsible for crime than any other race in America, okay? Even if that were true, the fact that it's coming from a white person, that statement will be deemed as racially insensitive or just flat out racist, okay? Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because many are reading Uriah Smith's letter, Uriah Smith is a white man, and because he is referring to black people, and it seems that he is referring to them in a derogatory manner, he is being accused of racism, okay? And what's really at the crux of this is Uriah Smith is referring to animals and blacks in the same sentence, okay? Which leads us to believe he is making a comment about he's making a racially charged comment that blacks are basically animals, okay? And we know there have been racist statements accusing blacks from the early times that blacks are subhuman, that they're part animal, part ape, and part monkeys, and all these things, okay? So we understand that exists, and so all of that is compounded upon what Uriah Smith is saying, and I want you to look closely at what we're talking about, okay? Now, when I first read Uriah Smith's statements, I'm going to be honest with you, I was taken a little back by Uriah Smith's statement because they seem blatant. They seem very blatantly disrespectful, okay? But the issue was really because I was interpreting Uriah Smith's words from the lens of the critics. In other words, I wasn't even reading Uriah Smith's letter myself. I'm reading what he said in the critics, their websites, and I'm watching their videos, and I'm like, man, those are horrible statements. So I wasn't even applying my own context to it. I'm reading what they're stating on Uriah Smith's amalgamation statements. Okay. However, once I had the correct interpretation, once I've read his letters in full, once I applied proper hermeneutics to his letter, and once I just simply examined using common sense, I realized that Uriah Smith wasn't being racial at all. He was being spiritual, okay? However, because of the history of slavery and racism in America, Uriah Smith should have been cognizant that because of the racial component of blacks and animals, he should have been cognizant of using that terminology in applying it to other races. Okay, so he wasn't being racist. He just wasn't cognizant enough. He just wasn't thinking when he made this statement. Okay, or maybe he was and just thought that people really would kind of understand what he meant. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote Uriah Smith's letter in full, and I'm going to add my own commentary to it so that you can understand exactly what Uriah Smith is saying. Okay, you ready? Let's begin. The vision teach, says the objector, that the Negro race is not human. We deny it. They do not so teach. Now, understand what Uriah Smith is saying here. Uriah Smith is kind of quoting his objector, his Ellen White's accusers, her critics, okay? Because Ellen White was accused that her amalgamation statement was basically calling blacks subhuman or blacks, not human. All right. Now, he's basically quoting them where he says that they are saying the visions teach that the Negro race is not human. And his response to what they are saying is that we deny it. They do not so teach. Okay. So this is Uriah Smith's opening statement to this document or to this article. And you must understand that this is basically the foundation or the backdrop of Uriah Smith's reason for writing this whole article is to prove that is not what Ellen White's visions are teaching. Now, the key to Uriah Smith's article lies in the next few statements that you're going to read, okay? And what you're going to see is that from Uriah Smith's own mouth, from his own pen, he's going to give you how he defines Ellen White's amalgamation of man and beast, okay? So watch closely what he says. This is key, so pay close attention. Mark the language. Now, in quotations, you're going to see that he is now quoting Ellen White's amalgamation statement, okay? So here's the quote. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast. You should be familiar with this statement, okay? As may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men. Okay, now, end of quote. He says this view, talking about Ellen White's view, was given for the purpose. Now, here is his definition of Ellen White's amalgamation of man and beast. He says this view was given for the purpose of illustrating, watch these next words, the deep corruption and crime into which the race fell. Even within a few years after the flood, that signal manifestation of God's wrath against human wickedness. There are two phrases in this statement that you must remember, you must keep in mind, okay? The first is deep corruption and crime, and the second is human wickedness, okay? I want you to just put a mental thumbnail, and just place them in a mental thumbnail in your mind, because this is the key to understanding what Uriah Smith is talking about, okay? Now, from the onset, Uriah Smith is letting us know up front, almost at the beginning of the letter, how he defines the amalgamation of man and beast, okay? Or what he believes Ellen White is referring to when she refers to the amalgamation of man and beast, okay? And he says, this, which is the mixing of man and animal, he says it's illustrating the deep corruption and crime, okay, that happened before the flood and after the flood. He calls it human wickedness, okay? All right, now here is what Uriah Smith is telling us. Uriah Smith is suggesting that just as the animal's kingdom's nature is to kill without conscience. I mean, have you seen some of these animal videos? I mean, let me ask you a question. Do you think the lion is sad after he kills? Do you think the hyena feels bad after they rip an animal to shreds? Ladies and gentlemen, animals can kill. Their instinct is just to kill, okay? They don't have a conscience. So understand, Uriah Smith is saying that the antediluvians have become so wicked that their carnal natures, their animalistic natures, had overtaken their human natures. That's essentially what Uriah Smith is saying when he is interpreting Ellen White's amalgamation of man and beast. He is basically seeing it from a spiritual aspect. Now, for those of you who don't believe that this animalistic nature is a biblical concept, you need to understand that I'm going to show you two verses in the Bible that basically prove that this is a biblical teaching, okay? Notice what Psalm 73:22 says. The psalmist says, "So foolish was I and ignorant. I was as a beast before thee," okay? The animalistic tendencies, the animalistic nature that takes over. Notice what the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 3:3, "For ye are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you envying, strife, and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men?" All right. According to Thayer's Greek lexicon, carnal means having its seat in the animal nature or roused by the animal nature. Okay. Thus, what Uriah Smith is telling us is that the antediluvians had given themselves so much over to the carnal nature, to the animalistic nature, that they almost ceased to be human, not literal humans, but from the spiritual aspect, they were essentially just animals. And this is what he believes Ellen White is referring to as this amalgamation. He's referring to it as a spiritual. And this crime and corruption is the animalistic nature that had taken over the antediluvians. Okay, now follow closely here because we're just getting started. Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you have to understand that regardless of how you feel about Uriah Smith, his definition of the amalgamation that refers to crime and corruption, that's going to govern the remainder of this letter as we go through it, because that's how he defined the amalgamation of man and beast, okay? Now, unless there's a clear alternate, unless Uriah Smith says, hey, I'm going to give you another definition of the amalgamation of man and beast, we are to take Uriah Smith at his word that when he says amalgamation moving forward, that he is referring to the crime and corruption of man, the animalistic tendencies that overtake a man when he's deep in sin. There was amalgamation, and the effect is still visible, and he quotes Ellen White here, in certain races of men. Okay? Now he says, "Mark, those accepting the animals upon whom the effects of this work are visible are called by the vision men." So here he's saying Ellen White is saying that they're men. So why are you trying to say that Ellen White is calling them, half human and half animals when she's clearly calling them men? This is what he's saying, okay? Now he continues. He says, "Now we have ever supposed that anybody that was called a man was considered a human being." Okay? So he's saying, hey, if they're called a man, that means they're human beings. He says the vision speaks of all these classes as races of men. Yet in the face of this plain declaration, they foolishly assert that the vision teaches that some men are not human beings. Okay, so just want to tally up what he's saying. He says, hey, look, except for the animals, okay, the vision refers to races of men. The fact that Ellen White is using the men terminology, how are people still saying that she is saying that they're not men when she clearly calls them men in the vision? Okay, so do you understand the concept of what he's saying? He's using this whole letter to dispel this idea that Ellen White's amalgamation vision refers to men as subhuman. Yet, despite all of this, his accusers and his detractors will basically reject everything that Uriah Smith is saying, and they will say exactly what he's saying that he's not saying. Okay? Now, I want you to notice that Uriah Smith calls anyone that declares that the vision is saying that, he says that you're foolish if you think that that's what the vision is saying. Please note that most of Uriah Smith's detractors have little condemnation for the first part of Uriah Smith's letter regarding this amalgamation. But what you're going to see right now is that the misinterpretation of Uriah Smith's letter begins here. Here is where the train comes off the track for most of his detractors, okay? And I want to show you that regardless of Uriah Smith using the first half of this letter to basically dispel the belief that the amalgamation of man and beast refers to blacks as being subhuman, his detractors will simply just dismiss everything that he says to make him sound like he is being racist. But does anyone deny the general statement contained in the extract given above? They do not. Now stop right there. Stop right there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is where the train comes off the tracks, okay? But I need you to understand, the train has not come off the tracks. His detractors are looking at the wrong train, okay? Now, I want you to understand, I want you to notice that Uriah Smith refers to two things in this statement. He refers to the general statement and he refers to the extract, okay? And this is where most of the detractors are making the mistake, okay? He asked the question, but does anyone deny the general statement contained in the extract given above, okay? So you have to see there's two components here, the general statement and the extract, okay? Now, what you will soon come to understand is that most of Uriah Smith's detractors they're basically conflating the general statement with the extract. What you must understand is that the general statement is different from the extract, okay? The general statement is contained within the extract. That tells you that the general statement is not the same thing as the extract. And maybe you think I'm parsing words here, but you're going to see that this is the key to understanding what Uriah Smith was trying to say all along. What you must understand is that when Uriah Smith says the extract, he's talking about Ellen White's commentary on the amalgamation, okay? In other words, Uriah Smith extracted Ellen White's words and placed them into this letter that he wrote on the amalgamation, okay? Do you understand that so far? That's the extract. The general statement is not Ellen White's words. The general statement is what Uriah Smith said. In other words, Uriah Smith's commentary is the general statement. Now, what's the general statement? The general statement is that the crime and the corruption existed before the flood and existed not long after the flood. In other words, his statement about crime and corruption being the amalgamation is the general statement that is contained or that he placed as commentary within Ellen White's extracted words about the amalgamation. Uriah Smith is simply saying, does anyone doubt that there is crime and corruption? They do not. That's the general statement that he's making. If Uriah Smith were suggesting that blacks were subhuman, why would he say, does anyone deny that? As if, well, no one can deny that. You have to understand the whole letter is really a response to the very people that are denying it. Why is Uriah Smith saying, hey, no one denies that blacks are subhuman? The letter, the people he's writing to are saying, yeah, we're denying that blacks are subhuman. We think that they're real people. Black people are going to deny that. Indian people are going to deny that. Think about the statement that you're accusing Uriah Smith of making. You think Uriah Smith is asking, hey, does anyone really deny that blacks are subhuman? Come on, guys. So he's going to spend half of the letter saying, we're denying that. That's not what the vision is teaching. The vision is not teaching that blacks are subhuman. And then all of a sudden, he turns around and says, well, hey, no one really can deny that blacks are subhuman. That's what his accusers are saying, that Uriah Smith is saying. It's almost like a Dr. Jekyll in Mr. Hyde. The very letter he's writing to is about people that are denying that blacks are subhuman. That's the whole context of the letter. That's the whole purpose of this letter, is responding to people who do deny it. So why would Uriah Smith say, hey, does anyone deny it? No one can deny it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be thinking here. I really want you to think, not with what you want to believe, not with how you feel about Uriah Smith. Hey, I don't know what's in a man's heart. I don't know what's in Uriah Smith's mind when he goes to bed at night, or when he went to bed at night. But I'm telling you that Uriah Smith is not saying what you think he's saying. So essentially what Uriah Smith is saying, hey, does anyone doubt that there's crime and corruption even after the flood? Who could deny that? Would anybody in their right mind say that crime and corruption doesn't exist? Of course not. That's why Uriah Smith said, you can't deny it. We can clearly see that there's crime and corruption, even today. He's saying that is the amalgamation of man and beast. Remember, it's not your definition. Uriah Smith has already defined what he believes amalgamation is, and that's crime and corruption. So he's saying, you can't deny it. Now, here comes the part where we believe that racism comes into play. All right. Now think about what he's saying. He says anyone could be silenced by such cases. Now, notice he doesn't say races. Notice he doesn't even say people. He says such cases as the wild Bushmen of Africa, some tribe of Hottentots, and perhaps the Digger Indians of our own country. After doing a little research, remember, we're talking about time and place. What I want to know is, even though I feel, or you feel, that Uriah Smith may have been making a racist statement, before we do that, we must determine what was Uriah Smith seeing in his time that would make him suggest that the Hottentots and the Digger Indians and whatever other groups were amalgamation. And remember his definition, it is not animal, human, subhuman people. It's people that are so deep in corruption and crime that their carnal natures have overtaken their human natures. Okay. Now, doing a little research, we can see what cases Uriah Smith was referring to. Okay. Or we can make a educated guess, okay, of what he was referring to, okay, in his time. Now, in a book called The Christian Review, we find a copy of a letter from a missionary who encountered the Bushmen of Africa, okay? Now, I want you to notice how he described them. Parts of it I'm taking out because I want you to focus on the crime and corruption that he saw in the Bushmen of Africa. And I need you to fight the Western social norms, because this is likely another white man that is referring to Africans, okay? He's simply referring to what he is seeing. And I want you to notice closely what he is seeing. He says, talking about the Bushmen of Africa, the men have several wives, but conjugal affection is little known. They take no great care of their children and never correct them except in a fit of rage, when they almost kill them by severe usage. In a quarrel between father and mother, or the several wives of a husband, the defeated party wreaks his or her vengeance on the child of the conqueror. which in general loses its life. So notice what he's saying. He says the Bushmen, they essentially kill their children. Notice what else he says. Tame Hottentots seldom destroy their children except in a fit of passion. So here I believe he's using tame sarcastically. He says, look, the tame Hottentots, they only kill their children in a fit of passion. Okay, almost as if I can see why they would quote unquote kill their children because it's in a fit of passion. But then he continues, but the Bushmen will kill their children without remorse. Remember, we talked about the animal kingdom that can kill without remorse. Watch what he says. He says, will kill their children without remorse on various occasions, as when they are ill-shaped, when they are in want of food, when the father of a child has forsaken its mother, or when obliged to flee from the farmers or others, in which case they will strangle them, talking about their children, smother them, cast them away in a desert, or bury them alive. There are instances of parents throwing their tender offspring to the hungry lions who stand roaring before their cavern, refusing to depart till some peace offering be made to him. In general, their children cease to be objects of a mother's care as soon as they are able to crawl about the field. Regarding the Digger Indians, now this source was not as thorough as the previous source, but another source says, thus, to this day, the word Indian in South California has its sacred and profane connotations. In the flesh, in the areas where they still survive, Indians remain Digger Indians, fabled in local folklore for their thievery, filth, and lechery. Okay? Now remember, Uriah Smith said cases. All right? So now we should have an idea of what Uriah Smith was referring to. He was referring to the cases that he heard about the Digger Indians, the Bushmen of Africa, and the Hottentots. Okay, he's pointing out the crime and corruption that he is seeing. Again, we have a white man that is referring to other races. And clearly we understand that white people were committing crimes even then, and maybe even more heinous crimes, okay? But he is referring to cases, most likely recent cases, that probably horrified them in the news. What can be more heinous than someone burying their child alive, feeding their child to a lion? I mean, look, there's a lot of crimes, but even in our society today, the crimes against children are considered the worst crimes. And so what Uriah Smith is saying, can you doubt that there is crime and corruption? If you doubt there is crime and corruption, haven't you seen the cases that we've been hearing in the news of the Hottentots who the Bushmen of Africa who are feeding their children to lions? The Hottentots who, in a fit of passion, to kill their children? And even, look, perhaps even the Digger Indians who are, reveling in lechery, I think that's how you say it. But understand the context of what Uriah Smith is saying. He's not saying, does anyone doubt that blacks and Indians are subhuman? Well, look at the Digger Indians, look at the Hottentots, look at the Bushmen of Africa. That's not what Uriah Smith is saying. People are simply not reading Uriah Smith's words. So in essence, Uriah Smith could not think of a more base crime than killing one's children. And that's why he says there is an amalgam. That's why his definition of amalgamation is the deep crime and corruption where the animalistic sinful tendencies of man overtake him and he becomes less of a man and more animalistic, sinfully, carnally, is what he's talking about, not a literal beast. Now that we have the correct context of Uriah Smith's words, I want to basically restate Uriah Smith's words using my own, our own interpretation as we now understand what he means. Okay, so here's my quote. Okay, and I'm basically restating Uriah Smith's words. He says, But does anyone deny the general statement about the deep crime and corruption that I wrote with Ellen White's quotation above? They do not. If anyone says that deep crime and corruption is a thing of the past, they could easily be silenced by a reference to such cases as the wild Bushmen of Africa who throw their children to lions, some tribes of Hottentots who also kill their children, and perhaps the Digger Indians of our own country who are known for their thievery, filth, and lechery. He says, moreover, naturalists, those who study organisms and environments, affirm that the line of demarcation between the human and the animal races is lost in confusion. Okay, so he's basically saying that even naturalists are saying that mankind is becoming less human and more animalistic. Not animalistic looking, not, lizard and humans, not gorillas and humans. He's saying that naturalists in his day were saying that the human race was becoming more animalistic, okay? And he's referring to crime and corruption, okay? He continues, it is impossible, as they affirm, talking about the naturalists, to tell just where the human ends and the animal begins. He's not quoting them, but he's referring to some of their documentation or some of the things that they said, okay? And then he says, this is Uriah Smith saying, he says, can we suppose that this was ordained of God in the beginning? Rather, has not sin marred the boundaries of these two kingdoms? Okay, so he's using naturalists to basically drive home his point. Hey, even naturalists are saying that mankind is more animalistic. They're more evil. They're less compassionate. And so he's saying, hey, has not, and I notice what he says. He says, rather has not sin. Remember, his definition of amalgamation is crime and corruption, okay? The sinful nature. He says, rather has not sin marred the boundaries of these two kingdoms? Hasn't sin marred the boundaries between the animal and the human kingdoms? That's what he's saying. Now, in this next part, you're going to see that Uriah Smith once again addresses his accusers. He says, but says the objector, that's his accuser, Paul says that God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all face of the earth. And then they add, which shall we believe, Paul or Ellen White? He says you need not disbelieve Ellen White in order to believe Paul, for there is no contradiction between them. Paul's language will apply to all classes of men who have any of their original Adamic blood in their veins, and that there are any who have not this is not taught by the vision nor claimed by anyone. Okay, so he's saying, look, guys, it seems like he may be getting tired of just repeating this. Okay, so he's saying the detractors are saying, how can Ellen White say that some black people are not human when Paul clearly says we are all of one blood? And Uriah Smith is basically saying Paul's language applies to anyone that has the blood from Adam. And he's saying the fact that you are suggesting that the vision is teaching this, the vision is not teaching this, nor is it claimed by anyone. So again, he's trying to dispel this idea that that's what the vision is teaching. Okay, now Uriah Smith makes a sort of interesting statement here where he says, but for this text to weigh anything in favor of the objector, he must take the ground that God has made every particle of blood that exists in any human being. Is this so? And he says, then God made all the scrofulous, leprous, syphilitic blood that courses in the worst transgressors' veins. From any view which leads to such a blasphemous conclusion, we prefer to be excused. So now here, remember, he's not referring to races of men. His idea of amalgamation is crime and corruption. His idea of amalgamation is the wickedness of sin, okay? And what he's trying to assert here is that God did not make every sinful particle of blood. Whatever sinful part that is in a man, God is not responsible for that, okay? So he's saying, hey, yes, God made every man, but not every sinful thing in man did God create, okay? He continues, and remember, he's not saying it's a race thing, he's saying it's a sin thing. But what has the ancient sin of amalgamation to do with any race or people at the present time? Are they in any way responsible or to be held accountable for it? Not at all. Has anyone a right to try to use it to their own prejudice? By no means. The fact is mentioned simply to show how soon men relapsed into wickedness and to what degree. Okay, so in other words, those that were guilty of amalgamation, which is crime and corruption, in Noah's day, he's saying, what do they have to do with any race or people in his present time, in Uriah Smith's present time? Okay, regarding those races or the people in Uriah Smith's day, he says, are they in any way responsible or to be held accountable for it? Not at all. Accountable for the corruption in Noah's day. Okay, he says, not at all. Has anyone a right to try to use it to their own prejudice? So he's saying, hey, does anyone have a right to accuse the Hottentots or the Bushmen? Does anyone have a right to accuse them for the crime and corruption that occurred in Noah's day? Can the Hottentots and the Bushmen and the Digger Indians be responsible for it today? He says, by no means. He says the fact is mentioned, simply the fact of the Hottentots, the cases of Hottentots and Bushmen. He says the fact is mentioned simply to show how soon men relapse into wickedness and to what degree. So here Uriah Smith is going a different route because he's basically he's foreseeing that some people will then say, well, if it is crime and corruption, then clearly there is a certain genetically passed down crime and corruption or amalgamation that has been passed down from the antediluvians to these Digger Indians, to these Hottentots, to these Bushmen of Africa. And so Uriah Smith is basically trying to dispel that type of prejudiceness that would come down and say, well, hey, this has been genetically passed down. He's saying, look, guys, there's no affiliation as, genetically, they're not responsible. Those that are accused of amalgamation in Uriah Smith's day, they're not responsible in that fashion from those that were accused of amalgamation in Noah's day. All right. Now he goes into the philanthropist. I can't say that word. He goes into the giving. He goes into those that give to people of all races. He says, but we are to take all races and people as we find them, and those who manifest sufficient powers of mind to show that they are moral and accountable beings are, of course, to be esteemed as objects of regard to philanthropy, to loving efforts. We are bound to labor so far as in our power for the improvement of their mental and moral and physical condition. Now, here is the second part where Uriah Smith is again accused of racism. All right, but I want you now remember, and this is why I've been hammering this into your mind. Remember, his view of amalgamation is that mankind is animalistic in its sinful nature. Thus, the human part of the man ceases to exist. Okay, so he's equating animal with sinful. Okay, you got to remember that as you read this statement. Okay. Now, he says, whatever race of men we may take. Okay, now remember his previous statement was about philanthropy. Whew, got it that time. All right. He says, whatever race of men we may take, Bushmen, Hottentots, Patagonians, or any class of people. He says, however low they may apparently be in the scale of humanity, their mental capabilities are in every instance the basis on which we are to work, and by which we determine whether they are subjects of moral government or not. Now, without proper context, when we look at this low humanity reference, it almost sounds like he's suggesting that, there's certain races that are basically animal. But remember his definition. Remember the premise of this whole amalgamation narrative. The amalgamation is that when the carnal nature has overtaken their human nature, okay? So in other words, their sinful tendencies is basically in the driver's seat. So when he says low humanity, he's not talking about biologically low humanity. He's talking about spiritually low humanity because the carnal nature is in control. However, they can determine if individuals are part of the moral government by an individual's mind, okay? So he's saying we're not even necessarily even looking at what they're doing. We have to look at their mind, okay? And this is where we connect the gospel to people. It is not what a person is doing. We have to talk with them and we have to preach the gospel to them, okay? And if they can understand the gospel, if they could understand that there is a God, there is a Savior who died for them, then they can be accepted and they can be part of the moral government, okay? If a man cannot understand who Christ is, if a man cannot understand that there is a Savior who died for his sins, how can he become moral? Uriah Smith is essentially saying the only way that someone can be part of the moral government is through their mind. They have to accept Christ as their personal Savior. So we're not going to even look at what they're involved into. We're going to judge it. We're going to, even if that's what we're told, we're going to judge it on their mental capabilities, because that's how you win someone to the gospel. They have to understand. They have to be able to accept Christ as their personal Savior. Okay. Then Uriah Smith ends by saying, then what about all this ado over the charge, which is itself false, that the visions teach that the Negro is not human being? What does it amount to? It is simply an effort to create prejudice in the minds of the people, unworthy anyone who makes any pretensions to being a Christian or even a gentleman. So Uriah Smith begins by trying to refute the charge. He ends by trying to refute the charge. But despite countless efforts that Uriah Smith continues to say, guys, the vision is not about black people being subhuman, his detractors simply ignore every statement that he's making to further the narrative that Uriah Smith is making a racist statement. I hope you can see that Uriah Smith's issue was not a racial issue, it was a spiritual one. His whole contention is that the amalgamation of man and beast was referring to the animalistic nature that overtakes a man when he's in sin, the carnal nature, the animalistic tendencies to commit crime without any remorse or any care in the world. This is what Uriah Smith was referring to when he was interpreting Ellen White's vision of the amalgamation, okay? I do admit that there was a couple of statements I think he could have reworded a little bit better, because he's referring to blacks and low humanity in the same sentence. He is a white man. He has to be cognizant that this will be construed or taken out of context. And I believe that's exactly what is happening. Despite the evidence, despite the context that we've ascertained in this video regarding Uriah Smith's statements, his detractors, his accusers, will still accuse Uriah Smith of racism. And I'm okay with that, because my goal is to not convert a man. My goal is to not force you to do what I want you to do. I'm simply presenting what the Lord has shown me, and it is up to you to allow the Lord to open your minds and to touch your hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what a man is thinking when he goes to bed. I don't know what Uriah Smith, what was in his heart, but what I can tell you, the letter that he wrote about amalgamation was not a letter about racism. It was a letter about spiritual crime and corruption. I'm the Adventist watchman, and now you know the truth, the true meaning of Uriah Smith's letter, his article on the amalgamation of man and beast. God bless.